Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from the Infinetics research team. I'm Joanne Emery, and I'm the event director at Infinetics. I want to thank you all for sharing your time with us today. The session today is co-presented by Infinetics Research and our partner, Cloudmark. And today's topic, it's something that's, I know, top of mind with a lot of organizations, and I have to say it can be a frightening topic, too, for organizations all around the world. So we are going to be looking at domain name security infrastructure, and as you can see from our title here, the panel is going to look at how you can best protect your organization from DNS security threats. So before we get started with our presentation, I'm going to just go over some features that you can access during the webinar, and I also want to let you know how we want you to participate on the discussion today. So first of all, a quick note about the console that you see now on your screen. We have preloaded windows, and that's for your viewing today, but you can also customize your own screen view. So if you do want to resize any of the windows that are open, just grab the bottom right-hand corner and drag. You can also open or close any of the windows to suit your preference, and you should see a number of buttons along the bottom of your console, and these widgets contain additional features that we have for you today. One area I want to call out is the resource list. That's the button that you see that looks like a file folder, and this is where you can find the downloadable version of the slide deck from the webinar today. In addition, in that folder, we have a number of items for your use, and one we have is a new Infinetics white paper that's authored by the Infinetics security analyst Jeff Wilson, who's leading the discussion today, and that's on protecting DNS infrastructure. You're also going to find a Cloudmark infographic that outlines the threat of DNS attacks to organizations, and there are a number of other links to white papers, data sheets, solutions, and just a great lineup of collateral material. So I do encourage you to check that section out. And all the information can be downloaded directly from the console today. I also want to talk about how you can participate in the discussion today. First, we will have a poll for you during the webinar, and we want to get your feedback. So your responses help the panel get a feel for your situation, and you can also see how your response lines up with others on the webinar today. And lastly, I'm going to mention the Q&A session. We have a live Q&A planned to run directly after the presentation. It's a great opportunity for you to get answers from your panel. Your comments and your questions all along the way will be read by us during the webinar, so submit questions anytime during the presentation. Just use that box you see on the left side of your screen. So now I'm going to do some introductions, and then we can get started with the presentation. So first up, leading the discussion today is Jeff Wilson, and Jeff is the principal analyst at Infinetics Research, and he leads the security segment for Infinetics. Jeff, welcome.
Good morning. Thanks, Joanne.
Great. And also joining Jeff on the panel, we have Neil Cook, and Neil is Chief Technology Officer at Cloudmark. Neil? Good morning.
Joanne.
Welcome. Great. Thanks. And now I'm going to turn the controls over to Neil, and we're going to get started. Sorry, not to Neil. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Thanks, Neil. Here you go, Jeff. Let's start with the presentation.
Yeah, we're both so handsome, it's easy to mix us up, I'm sure.
That's right. I got flustered.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Looks like we have a good group of folks on the call already. Looking forward to seeing more folks join as we move along here. Today we're going to talk about something that I think that is top of mind due to a bunch of recent events, which I'll go over in detail, and that is the security of your DNS infrastructure. DNS, I think at this point is well understood as, essentially being a public utility that's absolutely critical to the basic function of the internet, right? The roots of the modern DNS system are, 30 years old, 20 years old if you're talking about the distributed DNS that we use now. But one thing that we know about DNS was that it was never designed from the beginning to provide security. So we're going to do a little bit of an overview of what the threats are, talk about some details of specific attacks, look at the tools that are available today for dealing with DNS, and then Cloudmark will present very briefly their approach to protecting DNS infrastructure. So I'm sure most of the people on the line here understand very well exactly what a DNS request looks like. The point here is to really point out the complexity of the system, the number of tiers involved, and remind everyone that, again, we're looking back 20 years now to the foundation of distributed DNS. The point is, it's a bunch of exchanges across a huge distributed network of servers aiming to perform a single task. IP address mapped to an alphabetic host name. Right? Simple idea. All along the way, there are holes and openings and potential for attacks. And attacks of all different types is what we're really finding out now. And like I said, never was designed with security in mind, because when every piece of the internet as it was founded with this notion that everyone is essentially good and we all want to share things and be happy and hold hands. And unfortunately, we have learned over the last 20 years or so that that's not exactly the case. And it really is a public utility. Google Public DNS handles over 150 billion requests every day. Enterprises, service providers, home users, everyone expects DNS to simply work. And any interruptions in service aren't tolerated, even slightly. And it's this intersection of, hey, this thing is everywhere, and it was designed 20 years ago with lots of holes in it that hackers absolutely love to exploit. And here you can see in the chart, we're rapidly approaching 1 billion host names and 250 million active websites. So on that side of the fence, it's a target-rich environment. Now, every internet-connected device is a DNS client, essentially, and we're moving to a world now where we're talking about having trillions of internet-connected devices as we move into the Internet of Things. So the opportunity to compromise on the client side, on the server side, and everywhere in between is massive, and hackers are taking advantage of it already. So here's some lovely pictures. We have a spread of different events going back to 2006 and all the way up to 2013. 2006, we saw an attack on a controversial, I'll put air quotes around that, anti-spam provider, Blue Security. During that attack, spammers didn't really appreciate the methods that Blue Security was using, so they hit him with a DDoS attack. It was DNS-based. Blue Security redirected it to their blogging site, which then put their blogging site and everybody else's site out of commission, and within 2 weeks, Blue Security was out of business. So here we have a DNS-based attack that was used by hackers against the company, and within 2 weeks, the company was no longer functioning. Now, you can question whether Blue Security was doing a good thing or not. They did have some controversial anti-spam techniques, but whatever. It was a pretty serious event. 2008, we had a couple of interesting things happen. The configure worm appeared, and some later variations of the configure worm used vulnerabilities in DNS to help the worm spread and avoid detection. And then 2008, we saw the first to be proclaimed as the greatest threat in the history of the internet, or the greatest threat the internet has ever faced, the Kaminsky bug, which is basically where we got the notion of DNS cache poisoning, which is to date still the only thing that sort of standards organizations have attempted to fix as a DNS problem through DNSSEC. The bug itself, when discovered and disclosed, caused everyone to sort of scramble whether or not it really is the greatest threat the internet has ever faced. I think Heartbleed and a few other things since then might take issue with that. But again, exposing another problem with DNS, it caused really the whole industry to start moving on solving the problem of DNS cache poisoning. To fast forward now to 2013, two major events. The first was an attack by the Syrian Electronic Army, which was a hijacking attack, eventually used against Twitter and the New York Times. A simple DNS hijack with very visible results. And then in 2013, sort of punctuated from a security. There were a lot of. It's hard to say how it was punctuated the year from a security event standpoint, but at the very least, in the world of DDoS, the 300 gig spam house attack was huge news. And that was, of course, the DNS amplification attack that we have now been scrambling for a year to patch up, fix, and make sure that as an industry we're all protected against DNS amplification. So, going back now close to 10 years, a wide range of attacks, different types of attacks affecting different types of folks for different reasons. And everybody's at risk. I mean, consumers are at risk too, but they tend to fall under the purview of the service providers that they subscribe to. But enterprises and service providers both face a lot of potential risk. On the enterprise side, DNS infrastructure goes out of commission. You have a massive loss of employee productivity, application and service outages, depending on exactly what's hit, the potential for lost revenue, and as we'll see when we talk about some of the emerging threats, actual data theft using DNS. And then on the service provider side, the risks are related. Service interruptions, customer dissatisfaction, frustration and churn, lost revenue, and brand damage that can, the damage done to a brand can be very difficult to measure but significant. And anyone who's been faced with a major breach or a major DDoS event can tell you the importance of protecting yourself from the brand damage associated with a major attack. So, we're going to go over threats in some detail in the next section. Neil and I are going to kind of go back and forth and discuss them. But really they fall under two major categories: threats against the infrastructure, reflection and amplification attacks, resource exhaustion attacks, DDoS, hijacking attacks, and then tunneling and exfiltration, which is kind of, if we were to break this into the past or what we know about or what's already happened and we're really scared of today, I would put that mostly under the infrastructure attacks. And then the future, which is the thing that we're expecting that a lot of people aren't watching and that can cause major problems moving forward, are the tunneling and data exfiltration attacks, which we'll talk about in detail. But there's opportunity for data leakage, advanced persistent threats, and revenue avoidance using tunneling over DNS. So I'll wrap up this section. This is a real-world example of one service provider customer whose DNS traffic was sampled for about 30 minutes of time. 40% of their overall DNS traffic in that 30-minute sample was found to be malicious traffic. Now, obviously, that sends up a bunch of red flags because you don't want a bunch of malicious traffic. What's it doing? Where is it going? What is it? The end threat that poses is obviously significant. But the second is, if you're carrying 40% more traffic than you need to carry, then obviously you're building up a DNS infrastructure then it's possibly larger than it needs to be. This could be driving up the fact that this malicious DNS traffic is floating around could drive up your infrastructure costs. In this case, close to double. Almost half of their traffic was malicious traffic that didn't need to be there. So wrapping up with a little poll, and we think the first step to getting a handle on your DNS infrastructure from a security standpoint is visibility. So we'll start with a question, and that is, does your organization have comprehensive visibility into your domain, your DNS infrastructure? Not, skipping the question about what kind of security controls you have in place. Do you have a single console and a single place where you can get comprehensive visibility into every aspect of your DNS infrastructure? So I'll give you all a few moments here to answer the question, and then we'll take a look at the results. And like I said, I just wanted to preview the attacks in the last slide there, the last two slides there. Neil and I are going to actually go back and look at some of these attacks in great detail in the next section. So as soon as a few more poll results going and we take a look at the results, I'm going to hand it over to Neil, who's going to start talking about the actual attacks that we'll be looking at. All right, so we have a mixed bag. We have, roughly split into thirds. A third, yeah, absolutely, we have comprehensive visibility. A third don't, and then another third don't even know if they have visibility or not. We think for everyone, you have to at least start there, and then beyond that, we need to look at what you do after you have visibility, and that's what we're going to talk about. So from here, as we drill down into the attacks, I'm going to pass it over to Neil, who's going to start off by talking about DNS amplification attacks. Neil?
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, DNS amplification really hit the headlines last year with the Spamhaus attack. Quite a few other people have been affected. And I'm going to talk about how that works and who's affected by that kind of attack. So one of the things that's interesting about that is that I think most people concentrate on the victim of the attack. In Spamhaus example, for example, that they were the target of the attack. But what you get to be able to see from this slide is that, in fact, the attack has two victims, or multiple victims at least. Obviously, it's hitting the person that you're trying to attack with amplification, but it's also hitting service providers, the people whose infrastructure is being abused in order to conduct the attack. I'll take you through how that works. So the attacker wants to DDoS someone, and typically most attackers aren't paying for 300 gigabits of bandwidth, right? That costs a lot of money. They want to use other people's infrastructure, that typical attacker technique, whether it's DDoS or spam or whatever. So what they're doing is they're making use of open resolvers on the internet. These are typically things like home routers, which are in people's homes, which are pretty insecure, which generally allow, a lot of them at least, allow requests from anyone on the internet to make DNS requests through them. And they'll forward those requests on to their local friendly ISP's resolver infrastructure, DNS caching resolver infrastructure. So if you make their request to those botnets, and you make those requests, to those open resolvers, and you make those requests for domains that can any request to a domain which has a very large number of records, or a domain which has a lot of large records like DNSSEC records or text records, and you're getting a very large response back. And the amplification on these attacks can be almost up to 100 times. So obviously they don't want that response to go back to them, because now they DDoS themselves, so they spoof their IP addresses. So all of these requests that are going to these open resolvers are spoofed, and the spoofed IP address that they use is the victim that they want to attack. So let's say Spamhaus in the case of the attack last year. So those requests from the open resolvers go through their local ISP's resolvers. This huge amplification occurs with the responses, and those responses get sent back not to the attacker but to the victim. Now, so this has a huge effect on the victim, but if you think about all of the ISPs around the world that are being used to conduct this attack, then they also get affected as well, because now their resolvers are being used to send very large amounts of amplified responses, which can, of course, affect that infrastructure. It can cause the infrastructure to go down potentially. It can cause it to become very slow, provide very slow service. And one of the interesting things about DNS is that I think we all think about architecting our networks and how important it is to have redundant networks and extremely fast networks and low latency and everything. But as far as the user is concerned, it's the whole experience. And since pretty much everything they do starts with a DNS request, if the DNS is down or very slow, if it's very slow, then they see that the internet was really slow. They don't care that the 4G network or whatever is actually fine. It's actually the DNS that's not working properly. And of course, if DNS goes down completely, then they see that as just the internet went down. So that was kind of the big attack from last year. I think the next attack, which we call resource exhaustion, sometimes also called the NX domain attack, this is probably what's happening much more today. There are still amplification attacks going on, but we see a lot of resource exhaustion going on as well. So this is slightly different. This is, again, it kind of has it affects two different types of people. It attacks people with authoritative servers, and it attacks people with resolvers as well. So this one is slightly different in that the attacker isn't spoofing their packets. They're typically using botnets to do this. And what they do is they're looking up random subdomains of a particular domain. That domain is usually a malicious domain set up by the attacker. It could theoretically be an actual normal domain as well. What happens is they use the botnets to issue all of these random requests. Now, they're going to a random subdomain, so XYZ123, and then the next request is XYZ124 or 125, etc., whatever. And the point about that is, when it hits the resolver, a resolver is designed to cache results. Okay, so if typically you look up google.com, the next time someone looks up google.com, that result is in the cache, which means that most of the requests never hit the authoritative server, which actually contains the actual authoritative information for google.com, for example. But in this case, every single one of these requests has to go through to the authoritative server because it's for a new random subdomain which has never been looked up before. So that massively increases the load on the authoritative server. So it's effectively a DDoS attack on the authoritative server. What it also does is the caching resolver servers are designed to have a very high cache hit ratio. They're typically in the 80 to 90% cache hit ratio. And because all of these requests can't be cached, well, they're cached, but then the cache is never used, the cache hit ratio plummets right down. And we call that resource exhaustion because it's effectively exhausting the resources on the resolvers and the authoritative servers because they're just spending their whole time sending these requests on, waiting for timeouts or NX domains because these subdomains don't exist. And they gradually become slower and slower. Internet service is affected for users. And then, of course, ultimately they can go down as well. So, they're actually attacking both of these targets at the same time. And that's probably the most common attack that we're seeing today on service provider networks. So the next one that we're going to talk about is DNS hijacking. This is really interesting. This has been around for a while in various forms. Some people may remember the DNS changer botnet from a few years ago. What that actually did was installs malware on your computer which changed the resolver settings on your laptop or your computer. And it was sending you, every time you did a DNS request, it was sending that DNS request to a malicious name server. It wasn't going to your ISP's name server or Google or whatever you normally use. It was going to a malicious name server. And when you send requests to a malicious name server, they can return anything they like. They effectively have control over all of the lookups that you do. So they can send you to, if they want to send you to the place that you wanted to go to, that they can do that. But they can also send you to places that will install malware on your computer or try to do man-in-the-middle attacks for unsecured sessions, try to maybe figure out your banking details, those kind of things. Now, interestingly, the DNS changer botnet, all it actually did was insert advertising into your web browsing, which is, one of our researchers said, is a bit like someone breaking into your house and leaving advertising pamphlets around and not stealing anything. But the same principle actually can occur not just on your computer, but actually in the DNS infrastructure itself. So, for example, subscriber CPEs, which are the home router boxes which sit in most people's houses and access their broadband connection, particularly for ADSL connections, less so, I think, for cable. They are typically, they're not the securest boxes in the world. There was a recent, Belkin recently announced they had some issues with some of their boxes. Things like default passwords open to the WAN, which allow you to reconfigure the box, those kind of things. And so attackers can actually compromise those devices, the CPEs. They can do them in quite large numbers. There was a recent attack in Brazil where thousands of these boxes were compromised. And that any subscriber, anyone who's sitting behind those CPEs, those home routers, essentially has exactly the same problem. The router's DNS resolver settings are changed to the malicious server somewhere, in Asia or Russia or somewhere like that. And then all of your browsing from behind that CPE is then potentially compromised. And that can put malware again onto your computer, man in the middle, anything you like really. You're kind of owned by the attacker at that point. And it's very subtle because you don't necessarily know that's happening because you haven't even got malware on your computer at the time. So it can actually keep going for a long time until it gets detected. So, Jeff, I think you're going to talk a little bit about impact of infrastructure.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a common denominator here, clearly, from listening to you talk and from looking into this myself, and that is, DNS requires or relies on a pretty diverse set of infrastructure, whether that's on the user side or on the resolver side. There is no single giant warehouse that securely houses all the resolvers in the world. They're spread across providers all over the globe and enterprises. And the clients are laptops, phones, tablets, CPE devices, home routers, all of which, are they all patched properly? Are they all secured? Every vulnerability that exists at every layer is an opportunity to compromise DNS. And in the case of these infrastructure attacks, obviously we saw huge increases last year, particularly in the DNS amplification. Once it was discovered that there was a network of 26 or 28 million open resolvers, home routers and such, that could be used as a massive home router botnet to launch these amplification attacks. The hackers started using them, and they share that information. And just because we know those home routers are out there and a simple patch to those routers could solve the problem, doesn't mean that those routers are going to be patched. I don't know if you've patched your home router lately. I know I have, but I know probably most of the people around me haven't and wouldn't even know how to go about doing so. So solving the problem at the vulnerability level for infrastructure attacks, really ultimately unreasonable, because there's infrastructure at too many layers operated by too many people, most of whom have no idea what DNS threats even are. So yeah, huge increases in the number of reflection and amplification attacks. Went from 4% of all DDoS attacks to 8% of all DDoS attacks last year. We discovered this network of open resolvers. What else is out there? And mitigating these attacks takes a long time and can be expensive, $180,000, $100,000 an hour to mitigate a large DDoS attack. And then these hijacking attacks affect individuals as well as large organizations, and are very easy to pull off, difficult to discover and fix. All right, so now I think Neil's going to move into, so the infrastructure attacks are interesting, and they definitely exploit all of these weaknesses in this multi-layered DNS infrastructure. Now we're going to talk about something a little bit different, which is the tunneling and exfiltration attacks, which are kind of the newer wave of DNS attacks that we're seeing. So I'm going to pass it back to Neil to go through those. Neil?
Thanks, Jeff. So tunneling and data exfiltration, I think, as Jeff mentioned, is sort of the new wave of what people are starting to get concerned about with DNS. And if you go back to why this is starting to happen, I think you have to think about what Jeff said earlier. DNS is a utility. DNS is passing through port 53 on almost all firewalls, and is generally not being monitored from a security perspective. And I think there's very few organizations that are actually looking at every single DNS packet and saying, is this legitimate DNS packet? Not just is this packet on port 53 containing the DNS protocol, which is obviously one thing that you can do. You don't want people to tunnel HTTP over port 53 just because port 53 is open, right? I mean, that's an obvious one that you can stop. But this is more about, it's still DNS. These are still valid DNS packets going to DNS through DNS resolvers and into DNS infrastructure. But this is using DNS to tunnel data. Now, this is just the same concept as using a VPN. For example, you can tunnel all of your internet traffic over an HTTP connection. That's probably the most common VPN in use today, is HTTP. And exactly the same thing with DNS. Now, DNS obviously is much harder to do because it's not a nice stream-oriented TCP protocol like HTTP. It's UDP, packet-based, quite relatively small packets. You have a very kind of limited way that you can encode data, but you can encode essentially arbitrary data within DNS packets. When you do a DNS request to a specific domain, if that subdomain, instead of being a random subdomain, is actually a sequence of encoded bytes that represent some information. It could be a username and password that you're trying to exfiltrate from an organization. It could be just DNS, sort of TCP/IP traffic that you've encoded in like base 32, so it fits into a DNS packet. Then those packets can be sent through, and the other end can effectively unwrap that packet the other end of the tunnel and then send it on as if it was TCP/IP, for example. So you can create bidirectional tunnels over DNS. Now, if you think about this, this is really concerning because I think most people's networks, they're looking at web protection, firewall, web application firewall protection, even down to the application layer. They're looking at email protection, email security. They have all these securities and content controls and stopping people from going to places they shouldn't be going, but almost certainly not doing that on the DNS layer. So if you think about that, if you set up a DNS tunnel, you can actually bypass network security controls if you know what you're doing. You can also use it to bypass paywalls on Wi-Fi or bypass billing charges in mobile networks. Mobile networks typically don't charge for DNS. Some mobile networks do, but most don't. So if you're not getting charged for DNS packets, if you send all your packets as DNS, you tunnel them through DNS, then you don't have to pay. And the same thing for Wi-Fi. In fact, there are people that I've seen comments on various forums like, oh yeah, Virgin lets you you can use tunneling on Wi-Fi to get Wi-Fi on a plane and those kind of things. So, but that's the sort of more frivolous aspects. But the payment side of things, certainly for mobile networks and for the bypassing network security controls is much more serious. Even on the mobile side, though, I think if you've got, and we've seen this as well, if you've got rogue mobile operators in less well-secured countries, actually wholesale putting software onto their subscribers' devices so that when they roam onto another operator's network, they're actually sending all of that data over DNS so that they don't get charged by the other operator for that roaming traffic. That's much more concerning because now you've got huge amounts of DNS traffic and DNS tunneling traffic. By the way, a typical DNS user is issuing 10 to 50 DNS requests in a few minute period. You're talking tens of thousands of DNS requests with the DNS tunnel. So the infrastructure impact is huge as well as the billing impact. But then when you start to look at exfiltration, it starts to become even more concerning. So if you're wanting to exfiltrate data from an organization, whether you're an APT, for example, that's managed to get onto a computer in an organization, is sitting there silently trying to avoid detection, is trying to avoid detection as it gathers data, and is also going to try to avoid detection as it sends that data out, whether it's stealing company confidential information or whatever it's trying to do. So because DNS is typically not monitored in terms of what's going on in the packets, there's so many of these packets going out every day, it's typically been quite hard to do. Then there's essentially free reign for APTs to send this data out through DNS and not be noticed, and that's the aim really, and that's why this is becoming an increasingly attractive protocol for them to use. It's not monitored and it's not controlled. There's no security controls on it, and it's ubiquitous because everyone needs it. Excuse me. You can even use a SQL injection attack, for example. This has been fairly well documented. One of the ways that you can exfiltrate the data that you get from the SQL injection attack is by getting the SQL server to do a DNS lookup at the end of that, which then the DNS lookup itself contains the data that you're trying to exfiltrate. So these are really, really concerning. Things like financial services companies, anyone who's got customer-sensitive private data, credit cards, anything that's confidential, is extremely concerning to them. So Jeff, back to you.
Great. So, I guess what's really interesting here is, the first set of attacks, the infrastructure attacks, rely on all of these vulnerabilities and this complex infrastructure that's been built block by block over the last 20 years or so. These tunneling and exfiltration attacks don't care about the infrastructure at all. They can be executed even if the infrastructure was, if there were no vulnerable home routers, or if there was a central place that all DNS resolvers lived and were managed from. This is at the content layer, and we definitely see increasing concern. Whether it's just revenue loss and revenue protection on the tunneling side, or whether it's the integration of DNS into more advanced threats. Using tunneling as a method to actually not just steal time on a network, but to actually steal data. So definitely something in the next generation of advanced threat protection people need to start keeping an eye All right, so now we're going to, in the next section, I think Neil and I are just going to have kind of a conversation here. I mean, obviously, there are tools available. Everybody's got DNS infrastructure in place, and most companies have made a pretty significant investment in security. There are some tools available that can protect to some degree already today. So we're going to have a little conversation where we talk a little bit about those tools. And they really fall, into three basic categories. Your security infrastructure, the firewalls, deep packet inspection, intrusion prevention, appliances that you've already invested in have some capability to protect DNS. You've probably also invested in DNS Resolver and authentication server infrastructure, the infrastructure that's handling all the requests back and forth, making sure that DNS is up and running and operational. And there's some capability to provide security within that infrastructure. And then most companies have also invested in the whole set of tools for security, incident, event management, sort of offline analysis, looking at your DNS data offline and saying, okay, what's going on here? Doing sort of a more manual analysis of what's going on in DNS. So the first question for Neil is, how do people typically use firewalls and DPI solutions to mitigate DNS attacks, and what do you think are some of the strengths and ultimately some of the shortcomings of those devices for protecting DNS?
So these devices definitely have a role to play. Firewalls, as we said earlier, one of the things you can do with a firewall, or a next-gen firewall at least, is ensure that the packets that are going over port 53 really are DNS, as I said earlier. That's a classic one. And typically, I think network appliances have a role to play in a broad brush. They don't have so much of a granular capability with stopping some of these attacks, but they certainly have a very good sort of base level capability. Things like DDoS, for example, a lot of them have got, especially if they've got DPI level capabilities, they're looking at the traffic, at least at some level at layer 7, then the application layer, then they can definitely start to do things like rate limiting of packets, for example. So they might be able to rate limit requests from a particular IP or responses back to a particular IP, for example, which can help with some of these attacks like amplification, for example. One of the issues is with these kind of devices is they're typically handling all traffic. Most of these devices are seeing all of the traffic. They're inline for all protocols. And when the more granular you start to get, the more sophisticated analysis you start to do, then obviously the slower these devices get. So you have to be very careful with these devices. You usually have to keep the controls that you're doing fairly simple, because you can very quickly reduce the capacity of these big devices, which can handle all this traffic at line speed, right down, because you're just having to start to go in and do much more sophisticated analysis, and it really bogs the whole thing down. So, and typically with appliances as well, you have to scale vertically as well, so you have to buy a bigger appliance if you're going to start to do all this extra analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems like the infrastructure attacks in particular seem interesting because, at a low level, if you're dealing with attacks in the sub 1 gig range on an ongoing basis, it's reasonable to assume that somebody's firewall or IPS, if they're doing DDoS protection with that, if it's aware of the attack, may be able to manage it from a performance standpoint along with everything else that it's doing. But once you get up into the 5, 10, 50, 100, 300 gig range, I mean, there are even dedicated DDoS mitigation solutions that don't handle attacks at 10, 50, 100, or 300 gigs, much less a firewall that's doing that on top of everything else that it's already doing. So it seems to me that the scale of the problem becomes a particular challenge. And then also doing that content inspection at all the way up to layer 7, again, is very taxing from a performance perspective on the devices already handling as much as they can with all the other protocols that they're analyzing, much less DNS. All right, so the second set of tools that obviously most people have in place is the DNS Resolver and authentication infrastructure. So how can that infrastructure be used currently, and what do you think are some of the shortcomings?
So most DNS infrastructure, whether it's from the vendors or the open source, now has got some controls for DNS security, particularly around things like cache poisoning. I think you'll find that most DNS resolvers, for example, have got controls to protect against Kaminsky attacks as much as they can, randomizing the numbers that are used in the responses and requests, etc., so they can't be predicted. Also, excuse me. Also, they will do things like response rate limiting, which is a best practice where you can limit the responses that go back to clients, again, to protect against things like cache poisoning. So now I think there are some, again, because they're looking at this, the application layer, these application layer devices, then again, these infrastructure devices that are being used for DNS resolving can be used to do security as well. So they can start to look at what's happening, start to look at some of the more sophisticated controls at the application layer. I think one of the problems there is, of course, that again, similarly to the appliance route, you've got the problem that the more security you start to do, the more analysis you start to do, the more this slows down the boxes, and then you've got this tension between providing as many requests as you can per second and very low latency to provide good service to people, and then providing security. So there is a certain amount of tension. And I think also they're not a security company. Most of these companies that are providing DNS infrastructure aren't security companies, so they're getting threat intelligence. They might support IPZ, for example, which is a format for getting threat intelligence for a DNS server at the DNS level, but typically the feeds that they're providing they aggregate from a number of sources, and they're not providing those sources themselves. So they're not security companies. They're providing aspects of security, but they're not necessarily experts in security themselves.
Yeah, it also seems like, again, as with the firewall has a primary job. If we add mitigating 300 gig DDoS attacks to it, the firewall is going to fall over. Seems like the similar case is true for the resolver and authentication infrastructure, meaning it has a primary job to do, which is process DNS requests, and it might be able to handle at some level a range of attacks, but it's not designed to handle the extremes of attacks that are being pointed at DNS. All right, so then we'll move on to the last option, and I think this is someone that everyone does in all areas of security. This sort of manual analysis that you can do when you have a SIM system, or even if you don't, even if you're just watching traffic logs and watching trends in traffic and identifying. I mean, obviously there's some attacks that you won't miss, no matter how far you look aside. But how can some of the SIM or offline tools be used, and what are some of the shortcomings?
So I think probably one of the primary mechanisms that a SIM or offline analysis can give you is visibility. Going back to the question that we asked near the start of the webinar, it gives you visibility into what's going on to your network. So that's great. I think one of the issues is that if at DNS, the scale of DNS, the number of packets that you have to process and the amount of logging that you have to generate, just to put that into your SIM, if you've got any kind of large infrastructure, is just not practical. You're just overwhelmed with events. So that becomes challenging. But you certainly can use it for visibility. Finding things like tunneling, for example, you can do if you take samples of traffic and you analyze them. If you took PCAPs, for example, or you examine the traffic over a long enough period of time, you can see when this stuff is going on. I think the biggest problem with SIMs is that when you find stuff that's going on, it's very reactive. Typically, you've got a big lag between you when you've seen that the thing is going on and you can actually, when it starts to happen. So then if you try to feed that information back into your systems, let's say you try to sort of block domains or IPs, typically there's too much of a lag, and it doesn't, you always kind of trying to play catch up, and your systems may have gone down by the time your SIM has kind of got enough information to block it. So definitely have a role to play, but I think there's a need for more inline protection than the SIM can provide.
Yeah, and I suspect if you did a lot of focused analysis around DNS with your SIM, what you're going to find is that you want to make an investment in a dedicated security solution to protect against DNS threats. So it's like we said, it's a good starting point. But it would be frustrating to discover a tunnel or exfiltration over DNS and not be able to do anything about it very quickly. All right, and then the last question, you sort of brought this up, I think, at the beginning of this, is what about DNSSEC? We have this standard that was developed in the wake of the Kaminsky bug. Doesn't it, the naive question is, doesn't it solve all, it's called DNS security, doesn't it solve all of our DNS security problems? I know the answer is no, but I'll toss it to you to talk just to wrap it up, because I think that's a question that a lot of people have. So what about DNSSEC?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so I mean, DNSSEC is very, very important, and the main problem it's solving is cache poisoning. It's solving the problem of, can I trust the result that I get from this authoritative server, this packet that I get? But is that packet trustworthy? Can I put the results of that packet in my cache so that I know that really is Google.com's IP addresses and not some IP addresses that someone's tried to insert into my cache, for example? So what it's doing is it's providing a whole certificate chain of trust for signing domain responses from authoritative servers so that resolvers can cache and trust those responses. What it's not doing is it's not doing any encryption of traffic. That's something else that's actually been worked on at the moment. And it's not really addressing any of the problems that we've talked about today. Even things like DNS hijacking, for example, if they've taken control of your infrastructure, then the DNSSEC becomes irrelevant because they're pointing you at servers that won't even use DNSSEC. So it has a role to play, but it's a very specific role, and it's not solving all problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't do anything for all the DDoS threats, the infrastructure threats. Excuse me. And then also for these emerging tunneling and exfiltration threats, doesn't address those specifically either. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it to Neil, and before I do, I want to remind everybody that we are having a Q&A. We've already gotten some great questions in the Q&A tab, but feel free as Neil is going through Cloudmark's solution. Feel free to put some questions in the Q&A, and as soon as Neil wraps up talking about Cloudmark, then we'll jump right into the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Neil to get started.
Thanks, Jeff. So Cloudmark's solution for DNS security, go back to what we just talked about. Yeah, what we feel is that you need a dedicated security layer in front of DNS. That you can't just rely on network appliances, which you're doing all of this other traffic analysis, not granular enough. You can't just rely on your DNS infrastructure, whether it's open source from a vendor. You need a dedicated security layer, similar to the things that we see in email, for example, with dedicated email security layers or web application firewalls, those kind of things. You need a dedicated security layer in front of DNS to protect it from these different types of threats, whether it's infrastructure threats, detecting tunneling and exfiltration, these kind of things. It offers separate scaling from your DNS infrastructure, which means that you can really scale that infrastructure separately and make sure that your DNS infrastructure is handling requests at very high speed and low latency, and that your security layer is handling the bad traffic and filtering it out before it reaches your valuable infrastructure. So Cloudmark's approach is that we try to get the speed of appliances with the analytics you could previously only do in an offline solution. And when you've got a dedicated security solution for DNS at layer 7, at the application layer, that's architected for speed and security, then you can really do that. You can combine that really high speed with the kind of very, very deep analytics, and you can do all of that inline. So our solution is adaptive. It works. It learns about behavior in real time, figures out what's actually going on. It does behavior analysis of traffic over time. It has these time windows which can analyze traffic over. So it's very, very deep inspection of the traffic, and it can do it at this extremely high speed. It can all be done inline. Very horizontally scalable, but also vertically scalable. So you can look at using very large boxes, but commodity boxes. You don't have to buy appliances with specific ASICs to do the network packet processing, for example. You can still do it on commodity hardware. So and then looking into the future, everything's going to the cloud. You're looking at things like NFV. So you really want to be able to deploy this horizontally scalable way in the cloud, virtualized infrastructures in true cloud, elastic instances, and looking at also doing things like multi-tenancy. Again, you need a software solution that's got these capabilities to be able to run in a multi-tenant, cloud-agnostic, hypervisor-agnostic way. So a couple of options in terms of how you might deploy this. I think one of the options is a passive infrastructure. If you're interested in seeing what's happening in your DNS infrastructure, then you can put a security layer in front of your DNS infrastructure that looks at it in a passive way, analyzes the traffic, all the requests, all the responses, doesn't actually act in line, but it sees all of that traffic and gives you great visibility into what's actually happening in your network and all the security threats that are coming out of that. So you can use that like a SIM in the respect that anything that we find, you can feed that back in and start blocking it, whether it's at the firewall level or in the infrastructure level, but it's not actually in line, so it's not protecting the infrastructure in line. One of the nice things about that is that you can do with our solution is that we actually have the ability to replay packet captures into the platform in a way that actually simulates real-time traffic. So if you take a packet capture on your network, you don't even have to put our software into your network. You can take our software, put it on a machine outside of your core network, take a packet capture from your DNS infrastructure and replay that in real time into our software, and it will actually then give you the results of what was actually happening in that DNS network in real-time analysis, as if that traffic was running through the box in real time. Incredibly powerful solution because it really gives you the ability to sort of replay what was happening at that time without having to necessarily disturb your core network and put some extra software into the network. Next one is this is more of a typical active architecture example. There's a lot of different scenarios here, where the load balancers sit and all of that kind of thing is very flexible. But this is much more of an inline solution where acting as a DNS forwarder in this case and really blocking all of that bad traffic before it gets to the resolver or the authoritative server, etc. And then, as you can see here, you can scale these two pieces of technology completely separately. So, if you need to add new infrastructure for your resolvers, you can do that independently from the security solution and vice versa. And this, we think, is the optimal solution. If you look at most security solutions, they don't combine the application, the actual application itself with the security layer. You have separate application and security layers. And then finally, this is just a typical sort of transparent proxy mode deployment. So if you're interested in protecting traffic either to your subscriber network from DNS or from your subscriber network that's going out to the internet, for example, making sure that people are only using legitimate third-party DNS services and not malicious services like DNS hijacking we talked about, protecting your CPEs from being compromised, that kind of thing, then you can put our solution in as a truly transparent proxy, which will actually protect all of that traffic over port 53 that's going to and from your subscriber network. So with that, I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil. Short and sweet. So just to quickly wrap up, and then we'll dive right into the Q&A. If you're looking for new solutions for DNS security, I think you need to start with comprehensive visibility and then look for solutions that provide real-time response or as close as possible. If we've learned anything from looking at all of the threat reports and events that have happened over the last few years, that closing the response window is really key to minimizing the damage, and it's something that as an industry we're not doing that well at right now. Obviously has to be scalable. You're talking about tiny tunnels carrying a few bytes all the way up to 300 gig plus DDoS amplification attacks, all focused on the same protocol, and consolidated, a single place to view, manage, and secure DNS traffic. It's not like other protocols on your network. It doesn't have a big margin or any margin for error. Because when DNS goes out, the internet connectivity goes out, and everyone loses their minds. And so we think it really does make sense at this point to have a consolidated security solution for DNS. All right, so I'm going to dive right into the Q&A. We have a bunch of questions already. And actually, the first question that we have here that I want to ask is, someone wants to know, how can they tell right now if they had malicious DNS traffic on their network?
Okay, so if you want to know if you've got malicious DNS traffic in your network, then you can put a solution in, like we talked about before with the passive analysis, and actually something that Cloudmark will actually do, and we can offer to anyone on the call today or anyone who's listening later on, is we can actually, if you take PCAPs from your network, if you actually go into your network and take some PCAP traffic dumps from your network, we'll actually analyze those for you. Give you a full report on what's going on in your network for free, and we can do that for anyone who's on listening to this webinar today.
Excellent. So there will be contact information for you to get in touch with, and we have everyone's contact information here. So if anybody wants to take Neil up on that, you know where to find him. He's put his email address out there. We have an easy question here. What port is mostly used for DNS attacks? And it's, DNS traffic is port 53, UDP and TCP, so it's really just port 53. I don't know. There's not much more to it than that. Here's one. What is your DNS infrastructure is behind a firewall? Can it still be attacked?
So the answer there is yes, because the firewall still has to allow port 53 traffic through to be able to answer it. And there's a few technicalities here. If you have an authoritative server, for example, then that's got to allow port 53 traffic through on the internet so it can actually answer requests. And again, the firewall may be doing some simple. If you've got a next-gen firewall or something like that, or a DPI device, you can maybe do some simple rate limiting to try to sort of stop some of the more egregious traffic reaching it. But you still need protection there for your server to stop it from being overwhelmed by attacks. On the reverse side, on the resolver side, again, you've got a firewall. You certainly should be stopping any traffic from the internet going to your resolvers. Your resolvers should be configured to only accept traffic from clients on your own network, whether you're a service provider with a big subscriber network or an enterprise with a smaller set of networks, but it should definitely be configured to do that. But then with things like open resolvers, these are effectively breaches into your network which allow traffic into your resolver infrastructure. So even with firewalls, you can still absolutely be affected by attacks.
Okay. We have a couple of questions on specific attacks. The first is, how can I protect my systems from DNS hijacking? So what's the specific protection from hijacking? How is that implemented?
So when I talked about those three network diagrams that I showed earlier, and the third diagram where I showed a transparent proxy that was sitting there in the network, that's essentially the best solutions from doing that. So if you've got DNS traffic on your network from leaving from clients, from stub resolvers in your clients, then if it's not going to your internal resolver infrastructure, which if it is all going to your DNS resolver infrastructure, that's fine because it typically can't be hijacked. But most people don't prevent it from also going to like third-party services like Google DNS, for example, which is it's like voluntary hijacking, if you like. If someone sets up Google DNS on their computers or their CPE, then they're voluntarily sending that data. But this is about involuntarily sending that data. So in that case, that third diagram that I showed where you have a transparent proxy, like Cloudmark security platform for DNS in the network, and it's actually intercepting the traffic. And then what we can do is we know about what are the valid third-party DNS services that are allowed, and we'll actually let you go to like 8888, which is the Google DNS one, and other services, for example. But then we'll actually know, for example, you can say, well, everything else is not allowed. Or what we can do is we actually have threat intelligence, and we can say, well, we actually know that these are malicious DNS servers. And then you can sort of have some combination in between as well. You can look at, okay, has any traffic gone to this before? This is very unusual and anomalous behavior, those kind of things. And we can analyze the responses that you get back and see if they're unusual compared to normal responses. So a lot of things you can do in line there. But that's really that third solution we were talking about with a transparent proxy solution to stop hijacking.
Gotcha. Okay. Now we have another one. What are the best practices for securing your DNS from 419 spams? Everybody loves the 419 scam and DDoS attacks.
Okay. Well, 419 spams, typically you're going to use an email security solution to stop those from coming in. Having said that, interesting, Cloudmark, our heritage, we have a DNS solution. We also have an email security solution, so you might want to look at a solution like that. But interestingly, threat intelligence that we can provide actually also provides all that information from our email security solution. So in your DNS security solution, you can actually stop the people from going to those 419 websites. Depends how 419 is done, but if they're trying to get you to go to a website, then obviously you can block that at the DNS layer if you've got that in your threat intelligence. As far as DDoS is concerned, we think the best solution is this separate security solution in front of your infrastructure, whether it's a resolver infrastructure or authoritative infrastructure, putting this DNS security layer, something like Cloudmark security platform for DNS, and then that's going to filter out all the bad traffic. Essentially, it's scrubbing all that bad traffic. It's using behavior analysis or threat intelligence or whatever it is in order to scrub out that bad traffic, so only good traffic reaches your DNS infrastructure.
Gotcha. And then the last question, since it seems to be a hot topic, we have another person here asking about use of firewalls. So we're using a firewall, blocking DNS port 53 traffic and authenticating also. In this situation, is it still possible to be attacked, or or do they need to do anything else?
Well, I think it's very much similar to the previous question. I mean, if you're blocking port 53 DNS traffic, that's fine as long as the DNS traffic doesn't need to go through. So absolutely, firewalls should be used to block DNS port 53 where there is no requirement for port 53 to be coming in. So, for example, typically you would block port 53 into your network from external sources which you don't allow. That's very hard for an ISP to do that, for example. Typically, there are a lot of legitimate use cases where port 53 could be coming into the network. So it's much harder to do that. But in terms of, the most of the use cases we're talking about in today's webinar, you can't block port 53 to do that. You have to allow the port 53 through so that your DNS service can work. And it's the fact that is being allowed is being exploited by the attackers, which is why you can't just do it by blocking port 53. You need an application layer solution so you can detect the good DNS traffic from the bad DNS traffic.
Yeah. Unfortunately, since DNS is required in most situations, at least in one direction, it would be great if a simple block could solve the problem. But absolutely, I think what we're getting at here is you need to be inspecting the traffic that's going across port 53 so that you can know the good from the bad. All right. Well, that is the end of our time here. I'm going to throw it back to Joanne for a quick wrap-up. From Neil and I, though, I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for being on the call. Joanne?
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And yes, thanks especially to Neil and the Cloudmark team, and to you, Jeff. Great presentation. I hope the audience enjoyed it, and I hope you take away some points here, some good information. And if you do want to view this webinar again, you can come back to the same link that we provided you. The webinar is going to be available on demand shortly, so watch for that. You'll be getting a notice about that. We hope you join us for more webinars from the Infinetics team, so watch for those. And also, you'll be seeing a survey pop up, so please give us your feedback on this topic and on future topics you'd like to see. And again, thank you. Thanks, Cloudmark, and thanks, everyone, for attending today. Have a great rest of your day.